Hello, everyone, and welcome to my review on 19th century movies. So, I'm going to be talking about a few 19th century movies while also exploring a little bit of the history. So, let's begin with the 1870s. The first movie to be made was Passage to Venus in 1874, and the next one after that was Horse in Motion in 1878. Now, these two movies aren't exactly your typical movies where you record and then they end up going on something like film, so that way you can then play them back. These two movies were actually a series of photographs. In fact, Passage to Venus was taken by scientists who were basically just taking pictures of Venus as it passed in front of the sun. In fact, if you look at the image here, you'll see a circle in the middle of the image. That circle is Venus. And you are able to see an arc right behind it. That arc is the sun. So when you actually look at the photographs and go through them really quickly, it gives this impression of Venus just moving right in front of the sun. Horse in Motion is a similar concept. The guy who made the Horse in Motion actually used 12 cameras to take 12 photographs. So essentially, these photos weren't really made for the purpose of having a movie. But in the end, they kind of serve the same purpose as a movie because, well, movies are just a series of pictures that you just kind of go through really quickly. Now, you wouldn't really have any developments in movies for another 9 years. And that would happen in 1887, where this inventor named Louis Le Prince ended up making a 16 lens camera. Now, with that camera, he ended up shooting a series of photos of a man walking around a corner. So, again, this isn't really your typical movie because, well, it was really just a series of photos. The first actual movie would actually came around 1888 when Louis Le Prince actually improved his camera. So the camera now had one lens, and it would take a series of photos and put them on a piece of film. So Roundhay Garden Scene is actually your first film-based movie. Now, there isn't really much to be seen in that movie. I mean, it's only 2 seconds long, and it's just people kind of hanging out in the backyard. And that same year, Le Prince actually ended up making a short clip of traffic crossing Leeds Bridge. So he was just basically experimenting with his technology. So there isn't really much to see in his clips other than 2 or 3 seconds of everyday life. Now, Le Prince was not the only inventor trying to make movie technology. There were others, and one of them was William K. L. Dickson. Dickson actually worked for Thomas Edison, the light bulb guy. So in 1889 and 1890, Dickson actually made a series of films which are called Monkey Shines. So you had Monkey Shines number 1, Monkey Shines number 2, and Monkey Shines number 3. Now it's uncertain when they were made. It's believed to be either 1889 or 1890. Personally, I think that the first one was probably 1889 and the last one was made in 1890. But of course, that's just speculation on my part. Now, if you look at the image there, you'll see that it's very blurry. So that was really just the technology when they were first making it. But by 1891, the technology had gotten a lot better. And I got to appreciate Dickson because when he was working on it, he didn't just test the technology. He decided to have a little bit of fun while testing it. Excuse me. So, in fact, when you see this Dickson greeting right above me, so that's basically Dickson holding a hat, and he passes it from his right hand to his left hand. I mean, it kind of gives me this idea of a showman who's just kind of showing off. And then if you look at the image on the left here where it says men boxing, so these two individuals are actually not real boxers. They're people who actually work in the lab. So they were basically having fun while testing the technology. So I think that was pretty cool because, I think it's important to really enjoy what you do when you come up with some fun technology. Now the following year, you get your first piece of animation. Now, I'm not really certain which is the first animated movie or cartoon or film, but in 1892 there were actually a series of films that came out. Unfortunately, most of them are lost to time. So one of them that did survive, however, was Pauvre Pierrot. So I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. So this cartoon, surprisingly, was 15 minutes long. So unlike the inventors that were making films, their films were 2 or 3 seconds. Here you have an animated film that was 15 minutes long. Unfortunately, most of this film is missing. You only have about 4 or 5 minutes of it. I will say that when you look at the film, there is the big question of, is it any good? And the answer is no. It's actually kind of boring. But you got to appreciate this piece of animation because honestly, when you're coming up with something new, you got to start somewhere, right? And so here you have the beginnings of cartoon making. Now, Dickson continued working on this technology, and he finalized it around 1893, and he ended up making a bunch of clips in 1894. Now, he didn't just make clips in the labs. In 1894, he actually started making clips of like everyday things or everyday people. For example, there was this woman who was a dancer named Annabelle, and so Dickson ended up filming Annabelle doing a butterfly dance. He also had like a film or a piece of or a clip on like a bodybuilder, a contortionist, boxers, and at one time he had a circus that came by, and he ended up going to the circus where he filmed some cats that were boxing, and so that's where you get the clip, The Boxing Cats. Now, that same year, or early 1895, Dickson actually experimented with sound. So you actually get your first sound film in late 1894 or early 1895. Unfortunately, not too many people really picked up on his sound device. In fact, sound didn't end up being used for like a few decades later because sound it was just pretty poor quality. In fact, a lot of films that ended up having sound back in the early days, at least from what I can tell, the film was made and then sound was added afterwards. So when you watch like a film and you have like music playing in the background, that music may not have actually been part of the film originally. The following year, you get another inventor named Louis Lumière. So this guy was also trying to make his own video camera. And when he made it, he actually made a couple of unique films, or I should say unique clips, because they were also pretty short. He actually made the first science fiction film. It was called, and I apologize if I pronounced this wrong, La Charcuterie Mécanique. Basically, you have this futuristic fictional box where if you put an animal in it, you end up getting meat products out of it. So not really a unique science fiction film, and for anyone who has a soft spot for animals, yeah, you can probably skip it. Lumière also made the first comedy, known as L'Arroseur Arrosé. So basically you have this gardener who was watering the plants, someone steps on his hose, and he's like, what's going on? He looks at the hose, and the guy behind him releases the pressure, and the water basically squirts him in the face. So kind of funny. I appreciate Lumière for making something like that because, when you're testing technology, it's nice to actually see unique stories put on film. Outside of these two films, for the most part, Lumière just took like videos of everyday activities. For example, he got an activity of two blacksmiths, and that one was called Les Forgerons. And he had other like everyday activities that he filmed for the next few years. In fact, for 1896 to 1899, for the most part, films were just clips of everyday activities, except when it came to Georges Méliès. Georges Méliès was not an inventor. He actually went to the UK and found an inventor who was selling technology, and he told the guy basically, hey, sell me a copy of your technology to make movies. So Georges Méliès actually was basically focused on the idea of making films. So it wasn't just, oh, I want to make a device for films, I just want to focus on films. And while he did make a lot of everyday videos, he also made some unique like films. In fact, one of the unique films was The Haunted Castle from 1896. This film is actually the first horror flick, and this one was actually 3 minutes long. And the thing about this film is that, well, when I watched it, I couldn't help but think about this video game series called Castlevania. The reason why is because the owner of the castle, I get the impression that it's a vampire, and this vampire is able to summon ghosts and witches and other like beings and objects. So you get this guy who ends up walking into this castle, and he ends up basically facing the vampire. So for anyone who's familiar with the Castlevania video game, that should basically sound familiar. In fact, what I find very interesting is that the original Castlevania, there was actually a port that came out for the arcade, and that port was called Haunted Castle. Coincidence? Now, I doubt Castlevania was based off of this film, and if it was, well, honestly, I would say that I'd rather play Castlevania. Nonetheless, for anyone who has played Castlevania, you should maybe try checking out Haunted Castle because it's just interesting to see this film and that basically the first horror film is similar to Castlevania. It was just weird. 2 years later, Méliès made this film called The Astronomer's Dream, and you can tell that Méliès put a lot of effort in the scenery. I mean, in this film, you have an astronomer who falls asleep, and in his dream, he notices that the moon is eating his telescope. Now, if you look at that image right above me, you'll notice that by the mouth of the moon, there is the astronomer, or the actor playing the astronomer, and the moon isn't just an image, it's like a prop. The mouth actually opens and closes, and stuff actually goes in there. So you can tell that Méliès really did put a lot of effort into that clip. And this clip, again, is 3 minutes long, so it's not like 20 seconds. Now, the following year, Méliès actually expanded on what he was doing with his movies. Because generally, in 1898 and before that, movies were really filmed in just one location, so it was just like one scene. But in 1899, with Cinderella, Méliès actually filmed in different scenes, or different locations. So you have multiple scenes in Cinderella. In fact, Cinderella was 5.5 minutes long. Well, 5.5 to 6 minutes long. But yeah, I just thought it was really interesting. Méliès really was focused on really building narratives. And yeah, I just thought that was pretty cool. But essentially, that's basically it. So if anyone's really interested in watching like early clips, even if they're just like 20 seconds long or even 3 seconds long, you can always check out the inventors I mentioned in my presentation. But if you're looking for someone who has a little bit more of like a narrative, yeah, you should definitely begin with Georges Méliès, so that way you can kind of see like the beginnings of what would eventually become cinema. Well, I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I hope you have a good afternoon or evening.